The current state of the gaming industry is looking eerily similar to what has happened once before in the past. They say history tends to repeat itself when people of the future forget to remember the mistakes of their past, so it's time to break out those history books. Now pay attention, because this will probably be the only history lesson you'll ever be interested in learning. In early 1983, there was a bit of a crisis involving the gaming industry within North America. The industry completely crashed and burned, and many economists believed that it would be the end of the gaming industry forever. While the industry was still in its infancy as compared to the gaming industry of today, it was still quite a force to be reckoned with, commanding roughly $3.2 billion in revenue. But starting in 1983, the industry completely collapsed. By 1985, the industry's revenue dropped down to roughly $100 million. That means it lost over $3.1 billion in less than 2 years. In case you're not very good at math, that means the gaming industry went down in market value by 96.87% in that short period of time. I'd say that just about gives the big KO symbol to any industry. And this all happened for one reason and one reason only, because consumers started to get angry and they started to show it with their money. The developers and production companies during the Atari era of the first generation of gaming began to produce games at an alarmingly fast rate at the sacrifice of quality, and consumers started to notice. The reason so many bad games got produced in such a short period of time is because at the time, anybody who wanted to produce a game for the Atari was allowed to, and that opened the floodgates for a huge amount of horrible games made by companies just trying to make a quick buck off of the gaming consumers. Part of the crash also happened because of competition from the emergence of household computer gaming, which came at just the right time in conjunction with the flood of bad games. However, the main reason is because consumers simply got fed up with the trash they were constantly being fed. Games like Oink in 1983, shortly before the crash, were being produced and basically stood for the quality of all the games of that time period. Who created this horrible atrocity of a game, you ask? Well, if you couldn't tell from the video, it was Activision. Yes, that Activision. See, now Activision is a company that actually learned from its mistakes, but as you can see, it started off pretty pathetically for them. Then there's games like Secret Agent, where, actually, I don't even know what the hell is going on. That's how bad it is. Just what is going on up there anyway? I'm not sure, but I know one thing. It's not worth the price tag that these games had back then, and consumers seem to agree. And then there's E.T. the video game. This game is often used as a scapegoat for the cause of the crash of the gaming industry, however that was not the case at all. One game did not bring down the entire industry. The game is constantly referred to as the cause more as a metaphor than it is in the literal sense, because E.T. the video game is basically the prime example of just how low the level of quality was in the flood of games that bombarded and essentially suffocated gamers during this time period. People just got sick of it after a while. And yes, the rumors are true of a dump truck dumping off a massive amount of unopened copies of the game in a landfill. However, don't get your hopes up because the games were all processed and destroyed by the plant in less than a day. So why did this happen? Why did so many companies decide to start producing such horribly low quality games knowing full well that they were terrible? Especially when the gaming industry was capable of producing home run hits like Space Invaders 1980 for the Atari port, Missile Command, 1980, Frogger, 1981, Pitfall, 1982, Dig Dug, 1982, and the Mario Brothers, 1983. So why did the quality suddenly plummet to the likes of Oink and Secret Agent? And dare I even bring up the horribly console-ported version of Pac-Man? Believe it or not, Atari actually guaranteed the programmer that they hired for the job a massive payday before he even finished the game. So what incentive did he have to do a good job? He was already going to get a huge salary anyway. He was just trying to get the job done as quickly as possible at that point. And this is the type of mentality that completely ruined the gaming industry back in 1983. Everybody was just trying to tap into the gold mine that was the gaming industry. And it all happened simply because they could. Because consumers were so enthralled about being able to play console games to begin with, that in the beginning, they didn't really care about what the games contained. That is, not until they were introduced with those awesome hits of the initial wave of gaming. Since most gamers' experience with console games probably started with something like Breakout, Yar's Revenge, Asteroids, Defender 2, Q*bert, Adventure, or other classics of the time, odds are that they automatically assumed that the rest of the games would be equally as amazing, because this was all brand new to them, so they just assumed that the quality was going to continue. They were wrong. And because at the time anybody could make a game, it made perfect sense for any company to jump into this absolute money pit. Because if you didn't know already, the gaming industry initially became the fastest growing industry in American history, so who wouldn't want a piece of the pie? Everybody just jumped right in and tried to make their own game, push it on the consumers, and expected them to love it. But that's not what ended up happening at all. So when they were bombarded by this sea of terrible games made by third-party companies that had nothing to do with the gaming industry, it makes perfect sense that they would lose their interest in the industry as a whole. What's interesting to note here is that all of the good games of the era were made by companies that are still around today. Companies that attempted to leech their consumers failed for the most part, with even Activision facing certain doom if they didn't do something after that Oink catastrophe, while the other companies that developed games with entertainment as their number one priority are still around today to tell the tale. In fact, you should all be writing a major thank you note to Nintendo, who single-handedly saved the entire franchise from certain destruction. Their new console, the Nintendo Entertainment System, was already on the way to North America on October 18, 1985, and with it came a breath of new life into the industry. That breath of life was named Rob, or rather, Rob the Robot. ROB, standing for Robotic Operating Buddy, is the little-known savior of our industry. The idea behind Rob was that he was supposed to assist you in playing games using a cathode ray tube like the Zapper gun. Problem was, much like the Zapper gun, he wasn't very good at his job. He quickly became nothing more than something pretty to stare at while you played video games. Ultimately, Rob was fired by Nintendo after a very short-lived run, but not before completely revitalizing the entire franchise in the process. You see, Rob was released in North America on the same day as the Nintendo in 1985, and Nintendo was smart enough to see the crisis going on with the gaming industry in North America at the time, so they advertised their product much differently than other companies had been doing for their video games in the past. Nintendo initially advertised Rob and the Nintendo Entertainment System as toys, rather than as a video game console. This was because by late 1985, North American consumers in particular had become extremely hesitant, even hostile to the idea of more video games. Thanks to all of the companies in the Atari era that produced those horrible games just to make a quick buck, our trust had been broken along with our wallets. Nobody wanted to spend money on games that had little to no entertainment value whatsoever, and despite the best efforts of the companies that did produce good games, there just weren't enough of them to justify new console purchases. Thus, the industry was slipping, and the Nintendo Entertainment System, with the aid of Rob the Robot, effectively saved the industry through a little bit of intelligent advertising. Flash forward to the present day, and we see ourselves in a very similar situation. Odds are that by now you've heard of the controversy surrounding Mass Effect 3's ending. Don't worry, this video isn't about that, but it does serve as one example of the current state of the industry that you should all be familiar with by now, and is therefore a very good starting point. If you somehow haven't heard about it yet, here's a quick recap. The game released before the developers had a chance to finish. They were forced to scrap together a new ending in about a month's time due to the leak of the originally planned ending. Executive producer Casey Hudson and lead writer Mac Walters were the only two people who wrote the ending that shipped out with the game, so it's no wonder that it was so terrible because it only included the opinions of two guys. It wasn't peer-reviewed by any of the other writers. Whereas in all the other missions and all the other games and all the other endings were peer-reviewed by the entire team. But for some reason, this one wasn't, and 98% of fans absolutely hated the ending as a direct result. BioWare was forced to make a free DLC that has still failed to please the masses, and after releasing all of their single-player DLCs for the game, have failed to redeem themselves and the franchise name from the horrible fate it ultimately suffered at the end. While the DLCs themselves were nicely done, many people still couldn't get past the fact that their beloved franchise had ended so poorly. But the Mass Effect series isn't the only one to have fallen flat on its face during the end of its career. Going back to Activision again, Modern Warfare 3 also had a terrible ending that left the most devout fans with their hands raised in the air, confused and befuddled. After an amazingly epic single-player storyline, we got a very lackluster ending that most people began to loathe. Luckily for the franchise, the multiplayer is what people cared about far more, so we quickly forgot about the single player's faulty story, some people not even having played it. But even the multiplayer of the series has received increasing criticism over the copy-paste style that it has adopted title after title. Even Dead Space 3, a relatively new game on the scene, has received a lot of backlash and hate for its lackluster ending, although we at CleverNoob didn't really think it was that bad. And then there's Assassin's Creed 3, which also got a large amount of backlash from the fans and critics for, guess what, it's ending. And then there's Battlefield 3 and The Sims 3, both of which have received a lot of scrutiny from their fan bases. But I'll get back to that a little bit later. Perhaps it's just the number 3, or perhaps it's something far more ominous. Perhaps it is a repeat of the 1983 catastrophe, where companies simply stopped caring about the quality of their games and haphazardly slapped down whatever storyline came to mind first. What do they care? As long as we keep buying, that's all that matters. Consumer inaction and obedience is exactly what let the development companies get away with selling such low-quality games before, which is what caused the crash back in 1983, and that's what could lead to another crash now. While it's simply not fair to blame one single company for all of the problems the gaming industry has been facing as of late, there truly is one major player that has been exacerbating the entire situation and setting the bar low for other publishing companies over the last 2 years: EA Games. EA as a publishing company is not only responsible for the Mass Effect 3 blunder by rushing BioWare into making the bad ending, and perhaps not even allowing them to revamp the ending, but they are also responsible for the criticism over Dead Space 3 as well, likely for the same exact reason: rushing the project in order to make more money faster. And it seems to plague every single franchise that it can dig its claws into. EA is on a very strict time schedule when it comes to releasing games, and have thus far lessened the production value of every development company's games that it has been the publisher of to date. The producer of essentially every single sports game out there, EA came under fire in 2012 when they were caught for selling a new installment in the ever-popular FIFA soccer series when it was literally the exact same game as the year before. And I mean literally. The graphics were the same, the gameplay was the same, the engine was the same. The only differences were the player rosters. It was a despicable act that many players began to pick up on soon after and adamantly protested. Why should consumers pay money for the exact same game that they've already purchased a year earlier with nothing more than mere roster updates? Many would say that they've even done the same thing with the Madden series year in and year out. If these new titles each year only contain minor roster updates, then wouldn't it be more appropriate to release an annual DLC? From a consumer standpoint, that makes perfect sense, and is probably one of the only times where a DLC would be appropriate. But from a business standpoint, why not sell a brand new title each and every single year for $60, regardless of whether or not it's a copy-paste of the previous year with minor adjustments, if consumers just keep buying it? Can you honestly say you wouldn't do the same if you were the one making the money and nobody was boycotting the franchise? Despite how huge EA is, they have only become more fragile over the recent years. If EA keeps following along with this vampiric and genuinely lazy style of publishing, it's only a matter of time before they stumble over their own feet and file for bankruptcy, desperately trying to meet their own deadlines and profit off of flukes, rumors, and the tears of gamers everywhere. Don't believe me? Take a look at EA's stock value. It has absolutely tanked ever since the fourth quarter of 2011. Even before the whole Mass Effect 3 blunder happened, EA stock prices from the 2011 fiscal year look reminiscent of the Great Depression stocks. Of particular interest is this graph that compares the EA stock prices to that of the Nasdaq's. EA was following the ebb and flow of the Nasdaq almost perfectly up until November of 2011. So what went wrong? Do you happen to remember the blunder before Mass Effect 3's mother of all blunders? Well, that blunder was Star Wars: The Old Republic. The game itself wasn't necessarily a complete debacle, although it certainly had many major flaws, but the problem was trying to appeal to a market that was already monopolized. Investors in EA had high hopes for The Old Republic because EA told everybody it was going to be a WoW killer. The game cost over $200 million to develop, and it completely tanked no more than a month after it released. The reason it tanked was because it was quite literally just a reskinned version of World of Warcraft that had the Star Wars name slapped onto it for publicity. People caught on and immediately realized that despite the high development costs, the developers, again BioWare, completely forgot the fact that you can't simply copy the core mechanics of the leading game in the genre and expect your game to succeed. The core of the game was flawed from the ground up, and that's what ultimately caused this huge drop in EA's share value. Fast forward to Mass Effect 3's release a year ago, and the stocks just plummeted even further for EA, not seeing any new real sparks of life until this past month, when Dead Space 3 was released. And by the way, the rumors are not true. EA did not release Visceral Games as one of their developers, and did not cancel Dead Space 4. The stocks show all the evidence as to why. According to the stock chart, it looks almost like things are going to go back to normal for EA now that people have moved on from the BioWare blunders of the Old Republic and Mass Effect 3, right? Not quite. It appears as though the stocks are going to be taking yet another hit because EA just released SimCity, and as you can guess, it's gotten horrible reviews, mostly due to server problems. However, many fans are just unhappy with the game as a whole. But server problems alone are not enough to account for these overall horribly low ratings. A lot of games tend to have server problems shortly after their release, but there's more to SimCity's negative reception than just that. Between the DRM and DLC microtransaction issues and the fact that you can't even play the game offline, SimCity has basically just been one big disaster so far. In fact, even one EA employee speaking under confidentiality wrote a public letter to EA voicing his displeasure. You can read the whole article on Forbes.com, but what's interesting to note in the letter is that this EA employee cites the fact that EA actually has a consumer-first policy in place, which obviously they do not follow very well. We can only hope that EA finally realizes its consumer-first policy and starts producing good games for once. How many failures is it going to take? Because this is just starting to get ridiculous. And believe it or not, EA's troubles still do not stop there. Taking the stock history back to 5 years instead of just one reveals something even more telling. EA has yet to recover from the 2008 stock market recession that shook the trade markets worldwide. Right before the recession, EA's stock value was heavenly, with a stock value of over $50 a share. After the recession, it hasn't even been able to get past $25 a share. At the lowest point in this past summer after the Mass Effect 3 debacle, it was as low as $10 a share. That has a profound effect on a company's ability to produce games. So EA has quite literally just been struggling to survive ever since the stock market had that mini crash back in 2008. That puts things into a whole new perspective. While EA is indeed a very greedy company that completely steps over the line when it comes to practicing good business ethics, we can now look at this situation and realize that perhaps some of their behavior was caused by this tanking gaming economy. At this point, they're just trying to stay afloat each year by cranking out new titles. They might not even have the time any longer to sit and wait while a fantastic title is made. They've got money to make to save them from going bankrupt. Think of it as the big-time, multi-million-dollar company equivalent as living paycheck to paycheck. It happens more often than you think. Now, does this justify what they've been doing to consumers for the last 5 years? Not at all. However, it does offer us a little bit more insight into why they've been doing what they've been doing. Instead of trusting their development companies to produce hits, they've basically just been pushing them to get out as many titles as frequently as possible so that they can keep their stock prices up. Ironically enough, all this has been doing is actually hurting their stock prices and essentially killing their fan base as a direct result. In fact, if you look at the stocks for every other major gaming publisher and developer out there on the public stock market, you'll notice the exact same trend. Ubisoft, THQ, Square Enix, Atari, who have actually filed for bankruptcy earlier this year. Capcom, Konami, Activision and Blizzard, Sony, and even the almighty Nintendo. Even GameStop has plummeted since the recession. It seems like only Microsoft has managed to escape the broken economy of 2008, and I bet that it's solely because it's Microsoft we're talking about here. They're not just a gaming company, they're the developers of Windows after all. Bill Gates, guys, Bill Gates. But even they kissed the curb for a while there after the recession. So if the recession of 2008 even temporarily wounded the almighty Microsoft, then it's no surprise that it absolutely decimated the always fragile gaming industry, even when the global economy started to pick back up. People often criticize Valve for taking so long with their development speeds of new games, but you know what? Valve is one of the only companies that is succeeding at the moment, so perhaps giving themselves enough time to develop each game and ensuring that it will be a hit is exactly the model that the other gaming companies should be following at the moment. That's the model the gaming companies followed back in the golden era of gaming, and that's the one they should be following now, because it works. Now, some of their success is definitely attributed to the fact of the wildly successful Steam software. However, that's not the only reason that they're succeeding. The games that they've produced have overall been high in quality and the fans have loved them. It's also important to note that while technically speaking, Valve does actually have EA as one of their publishers, but the fact remains that they distribute their own games via Steam rather than actually through EA's Origin. So it's unlike any other relationship that any other developer has with EA, And to be honest, I'd go as far as to say that EA has merely been leeching off of Valve's good games in order to keep themselves afloat. Instead, we've been bombarded by crappy title after crappy title year in and year out by many of the companies I just listed, with the exception of a few. That cannot be a coincidence, and there's many more doing the same thing that I didn't list. It's because every single company I just listed has been so incredibly desperate for a hit to rejuvenate their market value that they aren't giving their games enough time to develop into those hits. And as a consequence, none of these companies have been able to get back to their former selves prior to 2008. Regardless of the reason, this is the nature of the current gaming industry. But let's be fair here. While the stock market values are low, that doesn't necessarily mean everybody is poor. No. They're far from poor. They have more money than they need, just not as much as they want. And even Atari, who filed for bankruptcy earlier, as I said, actually was only doing it to get away from their French counterpart. It's not so much the fact that they don't have any more money that they're filing for bankruptcy, but rather it's a marketing strategy in order to make more. But EA especially isn't broke. While their stocks are low, that doesn't make them poor. If EA would take it slow like Valve, then they might actually learn a thing or two and save themselves both in reputation and in sales. But I don't see that happening, and I predict that EA is going to go out of business in just a few short years, maybe 5 to 10 maximum. That is, if the industry even lasts that long. But if the industry does crash, I'm predicting that it will be EA who goes first. It's just a shame because they could redeem themselves if they only start practicing better business ethics. I actually think that before they go bankrupt, EA is going to become an exclusive sports game-only publishing company as a last-ditch attempt to stay in the business for a few more years. The only way they are going to be able to avoid this fallout is if they somehow are able to get their hands on 1 to 2 more hit franchises. But the only way they are going to get more hit franchises is if they allow their development teams enough time to work on their games like they used to before the 2008 recession. If they can't do that, then EA is as good as gone in less than a decade. So while we've been talking about EA and singling them out as a prime example of the problem, they clearly aren't the only ones. Almost every major player in this industry has been contributing to the problem over the last 5 years. And while it technically isn't their fault that the global economy tanked back in 2008, it is their fault for relying on cheap, quick-selling tactics in order to try and make as much money as quickly as possible. But they're just not understanding the fact that they're never going to get back to where they used to be unless they switch gears, slow down the development process, and start focusing more on the quality of their games rather than the quantity. To make problems even worse, we actually have a rogue gaming industry, also known as the mobile gaming industry, taking a lot of the revenue away from the main gaming industry and slowly leeching it down, much like how the computer industry had the same effect on the gaming industry way back in 1983's crash. To compound upon this ever-growing problem in the gaming industry is the issue of downloadable content, or DLC for short. The object of the DLC is to keep games relevant for as long as humanly possible, despite spending an extremely short period of time on the DLC's development. It's a cop-out that companies use to try and stay important in the struggling market in between the time of their game releases. It's cheaper, faster, and people seem to be buying enough of it to justify them continuing the trend. Each DLC costs a relatively small to mediocre amount of money, but only introduces an even smaller amount of content. DLC is desensitizing gamers and getting them to believe that it's okay for companies to produce games that aren't fully complete, only to sell further missions and storylines for additional fees later on down the road. It's a unique strategy that has been working flawlessly so far, and nobody has even noticed, but it has yet to restore any of the companies to their former glory. Back in the day, if a company wanted to tell additional storylines, they were going to have to make a brand new game. This forced development companies to slow down and take their time during development, and really refine and polish their games before their release. Back then, after the industry had picked up from the initial crash of 1983, companies were like an old skilled blacksmith who treasured each of his creations, producing amazing pieces of work each time. Now the industry is more like an assembly line, producing cheaply made product after cheaply made product, only to release these DLC packages in between game releases that you can buy for a nominal fee that ultimately end up collecting dust on your hard drive after you play with it for a day. Anyway, even Nintendo, the company that saved the industry on their own, has slowly fallen from grace thanks to the emergence of Microsoft and Sony, coupled with the popularity of online multiplayer games. Nintendo is a company that is trying to stay honest, but it's a little hard to do that when they're stuck treading water in the ocean waves that Microsoft and Sony are producing ahead of them. They have employed many different tactics and techniques over the recent years to stay afloat, but I personally believe that they're slowly starting to wither away. And if Nintendo goes, who's going to save us from the inevitable gaming crash? Because it sure isn't going to be Sony. Sony's newly announced PlayStation 4 is rumored to have technology in place that prevents gamers from playing a used game without paying an extra fee. Yep, you heard right. That means no more used or pre-owned games from GameStop. That means no more GameFly. That means no more bringing a game over to your friend's house to play with them. Nope. Each game is going to be locked into each console, and if you want to play it on another one, you gotta pay more money. If your console goes, tough cookies monster, you'll just have to buy the game again. Or I'm sure Sony will invent some kind of protection plan for a nominal fee so that you can get all your stuff back should that ever happen. If enacted, Sony would effectively kill themselves with this move, so hopefully somebody in the company stopped and said, wait a minute, horrible idea. But it seems that they've just been blinded by the idea that if they take away the ability to play pre-owned games on their consoles, that virtual purchases are going to increase on the PlayStation Network. But that simply is not how it works, at all. Now, some people are saying that this rumor has already been quelled thanks to an interview by Eurogamer with Shuhei Yoshida, the president of the worldwide Sony industry. Now, I would be inclined to agree except for this one little paragraph. When the Eurogamer interviewer Tom Bramwell asked, so if someone buys a PlayStation 4 game, you're not going to stop them from reselling it? To which Shuhei replied, so what was our official answer to our internal question? To which his advisor stepped in and told him what to say, and then Shuhei finally replied, so used games can play on PS4, how is that? The thing is, while that sounds all fine and dandy, I'm not so sure that I buy it. It's the way that he words it that makes me worried. It seems like there's more to it than that, and the fact that he couldn't simply just say yes is what I'm worried about. Maybe there was a language barrier and that could have been the problem, but if you'll notice, he never said anything about not having to pay for it again. So I'm not entirely sure that this rumor is 100% gone just yet. And despite the fact that Mr. Yoshida is generally a nice guy, I still don't 100% believe him, because the bottom line is Sony did file a patent for this type of protection. How they could use it for anything other than this purpose is beyond me. I won't believe that this rumor is actually gone until I can play the console for myself and see it with my own two eyes later this year. But it's not just Sony. Have you played an Ubisoft game lately? How are you enjoying that Uplay feature? It's awesome, right? Well, not if you rent games, because many companies like Ubisoft and EA have been forcing gamers to purchase multiplayer licenses in order to obtain access to the entire multiplayer feature of the game. It's this type of mentality that is slowly killing gaming one feature at a time. What's even scarier is that Microsoft is now thinking about doing the exact same thing. As a previous GameStop employee who regularly saw the nightly figures, this frightens me. Over 70% of the daily revenue at your average GameStop store is made up of used game sales. So as much as I personally dislike GameStop after having worked for them for over a year, seeing an end to them would be a horrible thing. I showed you what their currently struggling stock market value looked like, so for them to lose an additional 70% of their overall sales would completely destroy them. It would absolutely bankrupt GameStop in less than a year. Remember how quickly Circuit City bombed? It doesn't take much, and losing 70% of sales on an already struggling to survive company would be a marketing death sentence. What's even worse is the backlash that would wreak havoc upon the gaming industry as a whole, and ultimately come back to bite Sony and Microsoft in the butt should they decide to do this feature. Casual gamers would completely lose interest in the industry because they won't be able to buy their games from GameStop anymore, let alone the fact that they would no longer be able to bring a game to a friend's house to play without having to pay an extra amount of money. And you can kiss renting your games from GameFly goodbye, because such a thing would give GameFly nothing to continue their future business on. Should Sony go through with this and Microsoft follow, games would only be available to the rich and upper middle class who could afford to consistently buy them brand new on a regular basis, while the lower and lower middle class struggle to support themselves and their gaming addictions by having to pay full price for a brand new game that they might not even like. Eventually, they're just going to stop buying and playing because the used, pre-owned, and renting aspects of the gaming industry account for well over 50% of the entire business. When they go, so will the industry. It's marketing suicide just waiting to happen, and we might very well see the second crash of the industry unfold right before our eyes within the next few years as a direct result of this. Of course, that hypothetical situation is based entirely upon the whole no more used games thing actually becoming true, which at the time of this video has yet to be confirmed or denied. But as you can see, it would be a horrible move by any company, and any marketing firm should be able to see the horrendous repercussions of such an act regardless of where they are as a development company or as a retail middleman, which is why I personally believe we are never going to see it happen, thankfully. Phew, that was a lot of information to take in. In short, over the last 5 years, consumers have been getting ripped off at every facet of the gaming industry, and there's not much we can do to stop it, because it has become the norm for the majority of modern-day gaming companies. But there is hope. The only way for us as consumers to speak to them is with our wallets, because they're all too busy churning out the next dud to stop and listen to their consumers. While all of this gaming Armageddon industry doomsday talk is certainly scary to us as gamers, we have to open up our eyes and acknowledge the fact that it's happening right now, and then do something about it. Ironically, it seems as though the only way we're ever going to see a change in this industry is to force another gaming crash. None of us want to see it happen again, but it's the only way to speak to these companies who are too busy to pay attention to anything other than market sales. After all, consumers losing interest in speaking with their wallets is the very reason the gaming industry crashed in 1983, which then forced the gaming industry to shift their ideals and enter into the amazing era we all remember way up until 2008, where the gaming companies actually cared about the games they produced. Now, things are looking a lot like 1983 again. There's no reason we can't or shouldn't do the same thing here that we did back then. If we threaten this industry with our wallets and remind them what it's like to be without our money, then and only then will they start to listen. Hopefully they will wise up before a second crash hits, but if not, then the only way to make them listen is to put them in the red, just like consumers did back in 1983. And by the way, I'm not saying that you should boycott all of the gaming industry, I'm merely saying that you should save your money and spend it on gaming companies that you know produce good titles, not publishing and development companies that you know are just declining in quality over time. And don't worry, even if there is another gaming crash, I personally believe that the entire industry would bounce back from it and hopefully become even stronger than they ever were before after they relearn the crash of 1983 firsthand. The fact of the matter is there's just too much money to be made in the gaming industry, so nobody is just going to sit back and let that money run away from them. I think everybody watching this video can agree that the gaming industry has taken a major turn for the worse in the last 5 years as compared to the decades prior, so let's teach this new age gaming industry a history lesson. Let's write those angry letters and emails, voice our frustrations via social networks, make some phone calls, start some online petitions, and most importantly, stop buying games and DLC from bad production and development companies until they can prove that they can change. If we can accomplish this, then perhaps we will be able to usher in another golden era of gaming just like we had after the first crash was over and make Rob the Robot proud. But that's only going to happen if you as a consumer make it happen. You have more power than you think. I'm Julian Cluck from CleverNoob, and thank you for watching. By the way, be sure to come to our amazing community forums by visiting CleverNoobs.com, and don't forget to subscribe, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. Now, I believe you've got an industry to change. Have fun! And then I had Visceral become a necromorph. I thought that was funny. I don't know how many of you caught that, but that's like one of my personal favorite parts of it. I don't know. It took me so much time to make this, because I just had to cut out image after image, like all the logos, I had to position them.